Next up, we have a panel on navigating Gen Z, with a panel of experts to give tips and tricks on how to reach this tech-savvy audience. Please welcome to the stage Dan Murphy of CNBC. Thank you very much.
Shaul, nice to meet you. Hey, how are you?
Sure.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I think I'll sit here. Okay.
There we go. Please take a seat. Hi. Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to this CNBC Debate at the 2018 Innovfest Unbound conference. I'm Dan Murphy, and our topic of conversation today is navigating Gen Z. I'm very pleased to say that we have an expert panel of guests joining us to discuss the trends, the challenges, and the opportunities from this very important and emerging key consumer group. So ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome to the Innovfest stage our panel. Sitting next to me is Arvinder Gujral, the Managing Director of Southeast Asia at Twitter. Melissa Murray-Bailey is Senior Director for APAC at LinkedIn. Dr. Dennis Khoo is Head of Group Retail at UOB. Rameez Ansar is the CEO and co-founder of Circles.Life. And Shaul Olmert is the CEO of Playbuzz. So let's get started, and by way of introduction. First of all, Generation Z, also known as iGen, Centennials, and Founders, was born sometime around 1995. There are some varying degrees of age range when it comes to defining this group, but for the purposes of the conversation, we'll stick to 1995. And if there's one thing that shapes this generation, it's this. Generation Z are the first generation to be born into a world that has always had the internet. So think about that for a moment. This generation has always had the internet. Now, I remember my parents telling me about the time that the television arrived in their house. And as a millennial, I remember when the internet first arrived at my house. Basically, the internet came to the door one day, and it arrived in a gigantic box in a computer that was put in its own room inside the house, the computer room, and you had to run a gigantic cord from the computer all the way to a socket in the wall. Everyone remember that? That gigantic yellow cord, and it made all of those crazy noises. The screen was like this wide. I remember that day. But for this generation, the internet has always been around, and that's what makes this so exciting. So let's start our conversation. Generation Z, for the purposes of everyone in this room and on this panel, is your next wave of consumers. They are going to be your future clients and your future employees, but of course they are much, much more than that. So my first question for the panel is this. Gen Z is both a challenge and an opportunity for each of your brands. So let's focus on Gen Z as a consumer. What do we need to know about this consumer group? And why are they important? Arvinder, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. First of all, it's a privilege to be on the stage with this distinguished panel. So let's look at a disclaimer. You look around in the panel, and I don't think anyone qualifies. Most of us don't even qualify to be a millennial, let alone Gen Z. So most data points I have is either by third-party research or pure observation of my son, who is smack in the middle of Gen Z audience. When you look at Gen Z, it's a pretty broad age group, as is millennials. And I think what the mistake as marketers and brand custodians we do is we create one bucket called Gen Z, and we think that's the outlook we need to have to their audience. There are many audiences within the Gen Z audience itself, because it has a very wide, from a 20-year-old to a 5-year-old to a 6-year-old. And I think how you talk to a 7-year-old and versus a 19-year-old are completely two different worlds and two different languages and syntax. But when at Twitter we did a research across the world to understand this audience a little more, the things that come out and hit you very strongly, and I would probably say it indexes a little more towards the upper end of the age bracket of Gen Z. Point number one is they are short of money, but not short of time. And I think that's very significant. And that's the reason most marketers want to reach them, because at some point of time, they will be short of time, but will have more money. And at that point of time, if your brand was part of their consideration set when they had more time than money, they will probably carry that along in their journey as they grow into marketers or themselves as professionals when they grow up. I think that simple statement makes a big difference on your outlook on how you target and you speak to that audience, right? The other thing is they're very aesthetic loving. When as marketers, right, we reach out as platforms at Twitter, we've evolved as a platform. We used to be known as a text company, 140 characters. We now have made it 280 characters, but nobody even looks at characters anymore because you have live Periscope videos which can go unlimited. So we've broken the myth of the platform because the audience has given us feedback on how they want to consume, right? On multimedia, videos, GIFs, images. I just saw a tweet from a brand, which is a very serious tweet about something, and the millennial who replied was with a GIF, right? If you as a marketer who's sitting on the other side don't understand the vocabulary, you wouldn't know how to react to that.
Rameez, your view?
Yeah, I think thinking about Gen Z more in terms of a secular trend in terms of understanding the consumer is an interesting lens for us to think about, I think. And there's a few things happening in it, right? Few people, when they talk about Gen Z, there's a concept around being an idealist consumer or an individual or a group of people. So I think appealing to them in a very emotional way becomes very important. If you've looked at any of our branding, we try to evoke emotion when it comes to things around data in terms of telco. The second thing we've noticed is that they are quite difficult to please, but when you do end up pleasing them, we see that they tend to churn much less. And this is so counterintuitive because you would say that, look, this is, if you talk about a traditional customer lens, you'd say, look, this guy is difficult to please and will take a lot more effort, so the cost of acquisition is going to be much higher, and then I'm not sure how long this person is going to stay. But in Gen Z's case, we've seen that they tend to stay on for longer and then even become loyal ambassadors to the brand. But the starting phase is a much more challenge. It's almost like dealing with a kid. You have to convince the person that, you can trust me and I can trust you and we can go along this journey. So I think that's another thing we've seen. The third one that we noticed was very interesting is around the idea of course, there's a ton of things happening online. All of these people are online and they're being bombarded with a ton of stuff. So they have a lot of time, but they're also being attacked on all fronts. So creating ways for them and specific channels where they can actually provide feedback is very valuable because they will. For example, in our case, what we do is we have this inner group, this community of about 1,000+ people that are actually in our inner circle. So this is a closed-end Facebook group where people actually contribute a lot more. They've been selected from being high usage users, certain age groups and things like that. And they give us active feedback on what things should be. And it has gotten to a point where some of our most interesting ideas actually come from that. And every single day, it's like an active channel that's been run on its own. And they're basically doing the job of a whole marketing department in some ways. So get the idealists. We need to learn to trust them and create trust on our side. We have to have an emotional appeal. Functional appeals about the products just don't matter anymore, I think, because everyone's doing that. And the third one is create channels for them to interact in different ways, even offline, if you can.
Melissa, what's your own view? Gen Z and LinkedIn, is there synergies between the two?
There sure are. First, I was reflecting on your introduction. It made me think that when I was a kid, I had to decide between being online or being on the telephone. And that's a choice that my daughter is never going to have to make. But it just makes you think about offline and online, and Gen Z isn't thinking like that anymore. And so as we think from a LinkedIn perspective and what we're seeing with Gen Z, we're seeing students and young professionals flocking to the platform. And they're coming to the platform because they are used to having an online community. They're used to being able to get feedback and advice online when it comes to their life. here's what I ate for lunch. Does everybody like it or not like it? And so they think about that with their career as well. And as part of that, LinkedIn has actually launched career advice, where Gen Z and others can come onto the platform and they connect with people like us, the Gen Xers, who can give them advice and who can connect them to opportunities. And so we're trying to be where they are and provide them opportunities to connect for economic career opportunity in an online platform.
And Dennis, what about yourself? UOB is a very old brand, so how do you make it new again for Gen Z?
Well, then first let me start by concurring with you that this is really the mobile generation. I think the key thing is they're always connected, as you say, but I think we think a bit less of the fact that what happens when they are always connected. They are very hard to bluff. I consider myself an expert since I have 3 kids all born after 1995. They're always glued to the phone. You can't tell them things that your parents used to tell you, They know everything. So whatever you tell them, they can Google it. So they are self-reliant, they are hard to bluff. Because they have so much information, they're also value seekers. They know what a good price is because they have the information, unlike us, and they definitely have very short attention spans. Surprisingly, they are quite financially concerned, socially concerned, of course. A lot of the crises around the world and all the environmental issues, they're very much in tune with that. And also, they very much value experiences. Rather than owning stuff, it's about experiencing things. So with that, we've spent a lot of time understanding how banking will change for them. They will probably never visit a branch. They may never talk to a human being. All 95%, 99% of what they do in banking would be all electronic. And while some of us may not think that that's going to be very significant, at UOB we think that's going to be game-changing, because with banking becoming an experience and you can't really differentiate anymore on the product, you're going to have to make it an experience. And with that, we're going to think of ways of engaging the customers with data that we've, as an industry, never done well before. So these are the things that we're looking at, and our thinking is that the bank for them will be radically different. It'll be transformational, and the entire way that banks make money from this generation will be very, very different. And the banks that don't realize that are going to go away. And I'll leave with one important thing is that for banking, this will happen over 10, 20 years. Now, you all know the story about the frog. If you throw the frog into hot water, he'll jump off. But this thing happens slowly over time, which is why we're so concerned and which is why we're putting a lot of effort into redesigning banking for Generation Z.
I'll ask you about some of those initiatives in just a minute, but to pick up on one point that you mentioned before, and before we get over to Shaul, do you think that Generation Z trusts the internet more so than other generations when it comes to making a decision about a product or a service?
I think it really depends on the category. We know, for example, because we've done research on this, that in banking, they look still for trust. Now, a lot of the big tech brands are very trusted. If you look at Amazon, for example, it usually comes up as number 2 in the trust rankings in the US. So you can create that brand of trust, but they're still looking for trust because, and I'll let all of you know this if you don't, right? Actually, your money that you put in the bank, all of us went to the bank and tried to take out the money, it's actually not there. We've actually lent it out. So therefore, you need reliability, you need trust for a bank. You just can't, have anybody hold your money, right? You've got to have a responsible organization hold that money. And I think all the Generation Z understand that.
Shaul, over to you. Maybe just give us an introduction to Playbuzz as well and your own thoughts on Generation Z. Why are they important?
So first of all, this is the first generation or the first group of people that we can actually refer to as a generation. When I grew up back in the previous millennium, I had very little or almost nothing in common with people of my age that grew up in other territories in the world because we were not exposed to the same media, to the same content, to the same stimulation. Today, my 14-year-old daughter and a person of her age that she grew up in Israel, so a person of that age that grew up in San Francisco or Indonesia or Sweden are pretty much living a very similar lifestyle. They're exposed to the same environment and to the same experiences. And more than ever, the medium really does become the message, because when you think about the content that these guys consume and interact with day in and day out, that content is not really so much important by itself. The experience is important. When we had to choose between different media providers as TV consumers or newspaper and magazine consumers growing up, the content between each of them was different, but it was catered in the exact same way. Today, the experience on Instagram versus Twitter versus traditional news outlet provides a whole different type of dialogue between the message provider and the message recipient. So for us at Playbuzz, we created a content authoring platform that is being used by tens of thousands of different content creators all over the world, and they're catering to every audience, not only to Gen Z. And I would say that the interesting thing about this particular audience or this particular group of people is that they are no longer passive consumers, they are really engaging in a dialogue. And a dialogue has different attributes than just broadcasting to someone. A dialogue is bidirectional, and a dialogue is ongoing. It means that by acquiring a customer, you've only started a dialogue, and now you have to continue and maintain this dialogue, because this consumer has so many options. And it's so easy for them to move from a dialogue with you to a dialogue with your competitor or to a dialogue with someone else. So just grabbing their attention and getting the opportunity to interact with them is actually pretty easy. It's very accessible, but it's an ongoing thing. You constantly have to reinvent yourself. You constantly have to create new stimulation and new environments for a dialogue. Otherwise, they just move on to something else.
Okay, that's a really, really interesting point, because you present this idea that they are quite easy to engage. They're out there. They're relatively easy to access. But let's start a conversation about what Generation Z actually want in a good or a product or a service for the benefit of everyone who might be creating products for this next wave of consumers. So perhaps, Dennis, do you want to kick us off? What do you think that Generation Z actually want in a good or product or a service, and are there some defining traits?
Well, first, I think if you go with the very short attention spans, you've really got to captivate them. They're very used to video, for example. And in fact, today on YouTube, you can learn to do anything. So it's going to have to be very crisp. I think you're going to have to organize it such that it's really very friendly, because they are the generation that know what user-friendliness is on the web, on the internet, on the app. So you're going to have to redesign a lot of fundamental thinking around how you expose your products and how they consume it. I'll give you some very simple examples, right? If you don't need the information to be there, you wouldn't show it. So in banking, what we'll look at, if you have a zero balance account, could we hide it? If you only have one account that you're going to transfer the money from, do we ask you which account it's from? So these are some of the basic things you can do to really improve the user friendliness. It's also a lot about experience, which means engagement. So we're looking at how can we use data. How can we use data about their transactions to make their experiences better? For example, we know who you've paid, when you've paid, right? So we can actually pop that up in front of you and just ask you to authorize it, perhaps key in the amount. So there are lots of stuff that we need to think through in terms of how they're always online, how they consume information, their short attention spans. I think this makes for a radically different customer experience.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that?
I'd like to add that I think, and it's similar to what Dennis said, I think personalization is going to be a big theme, and there are different forms of personalization. I think there was an era where there was no personalization. You go walk in and there's one flavor of ice cream available, and then there's the Baskin Robbins of the world where you got 32 flavors. I think that's more the millennial sort of flavor. You can choose what you want. You've got a bunch of options. You can walk in and mix and match. And I think the generation now, and because we have the ability to do so, is more out, look, when you walk in, I know what you want. You want a pistachio ice cream with something to do with a chocolate, and I've got the perfect thing for you because I know you. I think that's the level of personalization we'll need to aspire to. And if we get there, obviously, I think we'll be able to build that sort of, oh, this is for me. This is not like being served as a broad broadcast happening to everyone. The second point, I think, is around, in a similar way, what we're trying to do is trying to build an accessible brand or accessible product. What that means is that, it goes even beyond personalization, which is can I make the consumer feel that they're part of the whole product experience or building the product, which means getting their feedback and making them feel that actually what they said is actually in the product. That kind of connection really makes them feel that they're part of the journey. So it's much more than just a consumer experience, but it's also the product experience. If we can do that level of personalization, and if we can do this kind of involving them in that product experience, I think we've got a really good solution then.
I very much relate to the point Rameez brought up, the first one about personalization. I think that the dialogue with the young consumers today is happening on their terms, meaning they're not coming to CNBC to hear what you have to talk to them about. They're coming only if they search for something or if they mindfully clicked on a link saying, you know, I'm interested in this particular thing and you are in a position to educate me or entertain me about it. So all of the dialogue is happening on their terms. And the content has to be, or the experience has to be about what they're interested, not about, you know, you no longer dictate the agenda. You are now, just as by moderating this panel, you are facilitating a discussion. So you are opening something and then it becomes a bi-directional dialogue. You have to be receptive to hear what they have to say and to let them guide the conversation. That's why content is becoming interactive, and that's why the experience is not about you know, them coming and being captive audience to go with your linear programming, but about giving them the tools and the access to dictate how do they want to run the dialogue.
Dan, I think one other important thing is that this will be the self-serve generation. They're very used to serving themselves. So you want to put all the stuff there so they can do it on their own. And they're very used to that. So they may not call someone, but they're very comfortable texting. So in terms of that, in terms of using chatbots, whether to help in the selection process, to help in servicing, I think there'll be dramatic improvements made in the next 5 years.
I'll just put a Twitter perspective on this. And something, there are two words for me that defined and that actually helped us look at our own product and change some of the way we serve Twitter to the world. The two words are influencer and community. Most of the Gen Z audience that we have looked at and we've spoken to and researched around the world, they want to be influencers in their own group, in their own social groups. And when they come online on any platform, they want to be part of a community. They don't want to sit in isolation and watch a linear stream of TV alone. They want to watch something but be part of the community watching and experiencing it together. And I'll give you two examples on how we've changed it, right? As I said, Twitter was known as the word text platform, right? We are all about video now, like most of the platforms. If, you know, one platform where this generation goes a lot to consume content is BuzzFeed, right? That's massively scaled up in the last decade. BuzzFeed has partnered with us to do two things. Every day, 10 a.m. EST, they do a 1-hour program live on Twitter to talk about topics. What topics? The topics that are trending, which have signals on our platform, which the audience is talking about. So when they do a live stream in the East Coast for the US geography, they are taking signals from the conversations that are already happening from the audience that they're trying to target, and that creates anonymity. So you've got a content that is matching with the voice of the audience, what they want to hear, and then you have brands participating in that conversation, right? But that's live. If you take a look at non-live content, we partner with NBA, right? The matches are going on right now, the finals are on. This is where the community aspect is. You don't want to, why do you think people go to bars to watch sports matches? Because they want to feel part of a community, like a 3-pointer was scored, you do a fist pump and you feel good about it, right? Twitter creates that kind of a virtual bar for you, where you can come in, see the comments that others are making, feel the roar of the crowd without being in a stadium at that point of time, but watch the clips, highlights, or live as it's happening. And this is the generation that's informing us which direction we need to take our platform in.
I think it also comes back to relevance as well and how a brand stays relevant to this generation of consumers. Perhaps, Melissa, you can speak to this point as well, and Arvinder, you can also weigh in. When it comes to ensuring that you stay relevant online, what are the secrets to success? Because in some ways, LinkedIn is not necessarily an essential communicator for this group of young people. They have Snapchat and they have Instagram. At the same time, Arvinder, how do you make sure that Twitter stays relevant so you don't suffer the same fate that, say, MySpace faced with millennials?
I might challenge the preface that you put out there that it's not essential form of communication. I think it's a very specific form of communication for this group. But as we look at the amount of students that are coming into the workforce, 10 million alone graduating in India in the last year, And so what are we doing to give them access to opportunity and connect them to jobs? For example, in India specifically, we're doing MTV Get a Job, where we're partnering with companies as well as MTV to give them that same level of experience that they're looking for, in the sense of it's fun and exciting and they connect to really great brands. And we're seeing tens of thousands of students flocking onto the platform so that they can have this type of experience. Also, when we think about Gen Z, not everyone in Gen Z is as blessed as everyone in this room. And so we're also doing things like LinkedIn Mentors, where we're inviting people from Gen Z into our offices to be mentored so that they can understand how do they have a profile that's going to allow them to connect to a job, to an opportunity to further what they can do in their life.
So first of all, I'll redefine our own growth. If you look at Twitter, when you said we may not go to the space of the way of MySpace, that could have been said about 2.5 years ago when we were a little down and out, right? We've come back as a platform. It's a great comeback story from a platform that was not doing well a few years ago. We've had 6 consecutive quarters, double-digit daily audience growth. Most of that growth is attributed to the millennial audience and the Gen Z audience, right? APAC gives the biggest chunk of that growth globally for us, right? So to say that we are becoming irrelevant, in fact, it's the other way around. It's the audience that is driving growth for us in this part of the world, which is giving us insight into what we are looking at. And that's the reason when I spoke about the partnerships we've done in the US, we've done 30 plus partnerships. Last October, we announced in APAC, right? We've had 6 World Cup partnerships in APAC right now. So when the World Cup unfolds, 14th of June, fire up your Twitter feed, and you'll start seeing content related to World Cup exclusively on the platform from broadcasters who have the right to clips and highlights. So this generation has moved the needle for us. Yes, we didn't move fast enough, probably, a while ago, but that's what's causing the turnaround of the platform, right? The other thing from a pure infrastructure perspective, we assume, as she said, not everybody in that audience can come to Marina Bay Sands and have a lunch, right? There are slivers of Gen Z that may not afford the lifestyle that we are sitting out here in this nice little hotel. And because of the insight we got from the emerging markets, and when I say emerging markets, I'm talking most of Southeast Asia, South Asia, some LATAM countries, you have an insight that one common mistake when we think of Gen Z, we think of teenagers and we think of drinking and parties and that. They're all rounded people. They have very similar interests like you and me. They want to know what's happening in the world around them, be it about news, be it sports, be it politics, be it entertainment, be it K-pop, which is massive in this part of the world, right? And if we are not giving them that content, we become irrelevant as a platform. And that's the reason you will see a lot of Twitter releases now are all about content partnerships, because we know what they're talking about it. All we can do now is to bring that content in front of them. So when we speak about 2-screen experiences or 3-screen experiences, it's becoming a 1-screen experience on Twitter because you got the video there and you got the conversations of the crowd happening right below it.
Does anyone else want to make a point on staying relevant before we move over to Gen Z in the workforce, which is another area that I wanted to discuss?
Dan, I'll just add on the marketing piece. We talked a lot about marketing, but there's also the sales piece. And what we see is the evolution of sales is going to be quite dramatic in the next decade as Gen Z becomes buyers. And that's going to be really interesting because the old role of a salesperson where you're going into Harvey Norman to buy a refrigerator and they say, well, we've got these 5 and here's everything about them. They're really in control of the sale. What we see now is most of the buying decision is made before they even go to make the purchase. And so the control of the organization and the company selling, they have to really take control of their brand online so that they can influence the buying decision when they don't even know that somebody's looking. And so the role of the salesperson will change quite dramatically, where they need to be able to offer things that are not available online. And so the bar is going to be raised for what they know about a buyer and what they can add versus what can just be purchased online.
Can I make one final point on that? I completely agree with what she's saying. One thing that we've noticed in the generation before the internet was we had hand-me-down brands. So I use the brands my mom and my dad or my elder brothers and sisters or my relatives were using, and we would read the same newspaper, watch the similar TV channels, consume the same magazines that were coming inside our house, go to the same consultants for be it health, etc. I think that's completely disrupted with the access to internet. They don't want to hand-me-down brands. They will research and find their media they want to consume, their healthcare professionals they think make sense for them. And because the decision-making kind of power shifts with more access to information, as marketers, we need to be very cognizant about that one fact, that their decision-making, even though they may be young at this point of time, they're taking those decisions and they're doing their own research. So how we disperse our information on the internet across multiple platforms is extremely important as marketers.
Now, all of you are hirers and firers as well, so let's talk about the opportunity for businesses when it comes to Gen Z in the workforce. Is there anything in particular that businesses are looking out for when it comes to bringing these young people on board? And are any of you actually looking for Gen Z talent right now? Any hiring happening out there?
I think one of the things that is very challenging is that their attitudes towards how the whole environment they work in is very different. So their, in terms of perception of how fast they should move, is very, very fast. So if you don't have the opportunities within the company, then they are also not that loyal. I mean, they might not stay. You know, so it is kind of the more me generation, and specifically from the context of Singapore, we also want to train our youth to question more so they can be more innovative. So from a managerial perspective and from an Asian leadership perspective, I think one of the prerequisites then, are you able to have an environment that's more open, that they are able to challenge the norms, challenge people who are more senior than them. Otherwise, they feel the frustration of not being able to voice out their opinions, and the encouragement that we're giving them that they should speak up more so that they can be more innovative. The kind of career opportunity you need to give them. You need to keep them motivated. You need to engage them. So it's very different from perhaps the Generation X and maybe even Generation Y, where you can leave them alone. And they will be loyal, they'll do their work, they may work for a company for a long period of time. So these are some of the things that we are grappling with. I also find that to some extent, and maybe this is more a Singapore context, they're a lot more sheltered. So their resiliency may not be there. When they have an issue, they may then think, oh, maybe I should have work for someone else, I may go somewhere else. So I think there's a major adjustment in terms of how, as leaders, as people who manage others, how we're going to adapt the way we inspire and motivate them.
Yeah, I think our experience, we're still, I would say, focused more on the millennials, and just when we thought we're now figuring out how to manage millennials, then you asked this question, which is a relevant one, because now we're starting to see people right out of university and getting in. And I think the bigger message that I'm learning now on this one is to also look at them just like you would look at your consumers. We have to build a trusting brand as an employer, and we've just recently spent a lot of effort and resources at actually in building that brand. So that brand has to be trusting, that brand has to have a mission, which is very important, and the brand has to have something where they think they can fit in and actually create impact. Part of it, frankly, is real. We have to create that, and part of it is actually communicating that story, right? And if you don't communicate that story, they'll see a disconnect, and just like any other brand, they will churn. So we've experienced now, only in our initial experiences, people where we have been able to make that connect, they have demonstrated, output that is far beyond what at least I would have imagined, or even what would be expected of a 21-year-old, 22-year-old. And, of course, themes around empowerment and et cetera, they also go and play with, that's relevant for millennials as well. But I would say just the bigger message here is that can we think of them as consumers, and we're building a loyal brand. And if they walk in and they're sitting at, having dinner at 9 p.m. with their friends, and they start talking about the company they're working for, not what the company does, but what they do and how exciting it is, that's when you know the NPS of that sort of brand is very high, and you'll see very high success rate in getting Gen Z and also getting outperforming output from them.
I think it's very funny that we talk about their brand loyalty habits. I mean, these kids were barely born, right? It's like yet very early to assess what is going to be their long-term habits. I see a lot of research. You know, it's a generation that even before they emerged, there was already so much research about their habits. I recently read a very thorough research by Google that assured everyone that Gen Z people are very brand loyal, guaranteeing them that, you know, it makes perfect sense to advertise to these kids on Google, of course, in order to win their long-term loyalty. You know, I just think that all of it is very premature, to say the least. But I do relate to the fact, whether we talk about the way they act in the workforce or the way they consume media or their brand loyalty, again, it's all about them. They have many choices. They are all of these choices are very accessible, very immediate. It's very easy to engage with a brand or a content provider or a new employer. It's equally easy to leave them in favor of a new one. So it's a buyer's market. I mean, these kids are used to an environment in which everything is at the top of their fingers. Everything is accessible to them. They are choosing who to connect with. They're constructing the dialogue in their own terms, and they're very easy to leave it if the dialogue is not going exactly the way they planned it.
Just a bit of a different perspective, and building on what Avinder said previously about people not wanting their parents' brand and their grandparents' brand. We see that the same in hiring, where before it was about what was the brand on your business card, and that was the most important driver for where many people worked. Now, when people are really integrating work and life, and we saw that with Millennials and that happening, they also want to be able to bring their whole self to work. And so companies are going to have to pay a lot more attention to what they're doing to create moments of belonging, so that people can be who they are, they can feel accepted, and they can do their job without having the mask that previous generations had to bring to work. And so I think companies who allow Gen Z to express themselves and their real, authentic self are going to find them to be more loyal and to stay and not be hopping to a place where they feel like they might have a better chance of being who they are.
One of the things that we've observed at Twitter, I mean, when we've spoken to Gen Z, let's be honest, a 20-year-old is probably still in college and doing internships, and that's when we interact a lot with them, and we have internships programs in Singapore and other parts of the world. And when they come in, obviously they bring a different perspective because they're a different generation altogether for most of the working folks. And as you said, we're still figuring out how to work with the millennials. Gen Z is a new one on the block right now. But the one thing that does come across is they're looking for experiences. They're not looking for vanity metrics on, I worked at this company. That brand is passé, because by the time they actually go into the job, that brand may or may not be relevant, right? But what experience they come in and they get at your organization, they carry those stories back, right? And as you are hiring for your startups or for your companies, when you're looking to get these Gen Z audiences in, it's a two-way street. You will get insight that you can, no market research, no third-party market research can give you, because they are in your door, looking at your product and giving you real-time feedback. On the other hand, they are the ambassadors for you to hire the next bright set of people and be your custodians of your brand when they go back to their schools and universities. So it's extremely important that when they come in, what experiences are you giving them? Or are you giving them some random project that nobody else wanted to do in the company? And if you fall in that trap, then you will tarnish your own brand by trying a Gen Z education exercise, but you're doing a disservice to yourself.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. But ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel for joining us today here at the InnovFest Unbound conference, and to all of our viewers on CNBC, thank you for joining us. Stay tuned.